The wind came first long before the storm, before the dust turned to cold. It crawled across the canyon floor like something alive, dragging its breath through brittle sagebrush and over splintered rock. Eleanor sat hunched beneath the ruined curve of a wagon wheel, her back pressed against the cracked axle, her arms wrapped around her baby girl. The child didn't cry anymore. She hadn't cried since the second night without milk. Her breath came shallow and slow, the skin beneath her eyes turning gray like winter bark. Eleanor's shawl was stiff with dried blood, her husband's blood. He'd been the first to fall when fever came. The others buried him shallow then. Argued about rations, about risk, about God. On the sixth morning they left. 2 mules, 3 rifles, no apologies. They told her she was young enough to try on her own. Now her lips were cracked, her bones hollow, her prayers worn thin. The canyon had taken almost everything, but not her daughter. Not yet. When the rider appeared, it was as if the wind stopped. No hoofbeats. No warning. Just a dark shape emerging over the rise, silhouetted by the fading sun. He came slowly, wrapped in a coat too heavy for the heat, a wide-brimmed black hat casting his face into shadow. His horse moved like it hurt with every step-scarred legs. A crooked gait, breath steaming even in the dusk. Eleanor's fingers closed around the rusted rifle beside her. She lifted it, but her arms trembled. The barrel dipped. She couldn't have fired if she tried. Her heart thundered anyway, louder than her voice could have managed. The stranger dismounted without a word. He didn't ask, didn't reach. Just knelt a few feet away, pulled a canteen from his saddlebag, and set it on a rock between them. He looked at her, not with pity or command, but with a kind of stillness that felt worse than threat. Then he glanced at the bundle in her arms. The baby wheezed a weak cough that sounded like cloth tearing. Eleanor flinched as the man stood and stepped forward. He moved slow like he'd done this before. He crouched and held out his hand, not to her but toward the baby. She looked down at her girl, skin clammy, eyelids fluttering. Her arms gave way. The man took the infant as if handling something. Already broken. He unwrapped the shawl, inspected the little chest rising faintly. His fingers were rough, scarred, yet careful. After a moment, he pulled a small pouch from inside his coat and sprinkled something crushed herbs into the baby's mouth with water. Then he stood, turned, and began gathering brushwood. Eleanor didn't move. Her rifle slipped from her lap and landed softly in the dust. The fire took quickly. He used flint and dried moss. The stranger stacked the flames low but steady, warming a pan he'd brought with the last of something stew-like. He poured it into a tin cup and left it near her, saying nothing. She watched him over the flicker of flame, her arms now empty, her mind torn between instinct and surrender. The wind outside picked up again, but softer now, the kind that came before rain. The baby stirred faintly in the stranger's arms. Eleanor's eyes burned with tears she'd long since forgotten how to shed. She noticed the man's hands, then calloused, marked with old burns. His coat bore a cavalry button sewn unevenly into one side. His boots were worn but mended. His horse lay nearby, breathing slow. One ear always twitching toward the fire. Around Eleanor's finger, the wind-worn wedding ring clung like a brand. Useless now, heavy, a memory she hadn't yet buried. Still, she said nothing. The stranger never asked her name. And she didn't ask his, but that night, under firelight in canyon shadow, a woman who had lost everything let a man she did not know hold her child. And somewhere between the hush of the wind and the pop of the firewood, that choice became the first thing she had reclaimed in weeks. The canyon air stung at first light, dry and sharp like old bones. Eleanor wrapped her daughter tighter against her chest, the baby no more than a whisper in her arms. The man had saddled his horse in silence. He didn't offer to help her mount. He didn't look back to see if she followed. He simply rode, steady and quiet. Through the twisting gorge where nothing green dared to grow, she followed on foot, one hand clinging to the saddle's edge, the other supporting her daughter beneath the staying shawl. Every step scraped her. Boots already split from the heat and wear, but she didn't stop. Not when the wind kicked up sand into her teeth. Not when the memory of yesterday pressed like weight against her shoulders. She just followed the man who had built a fire when no one else had stayed. They rode for half the day, deeper into stone. The land folded inward, narrowing until it opened again into a hollow. There, half buried in the side of a red cliff, stood an old trapper's cabin, slumped under the years. Its roof sagged. The door hung crooked on a single hinge, but it was shelter. And it didn't ask questions. He stepped aside and let her enter first. Inside smelled of cold ash, rodent scat, and the smoke of forgotten men. Dust clung to every surface. There was a table, three-legged and cracked, a stool, a hearth with blackened stones, a rusted kettle hanging on an iron hook. She saw a child's boot in one corner, half chewed through. Someone had once lived here. With hope? Then not at all. He built another fire. Not speaking, not rushing. When the flames caught, he left without a word. She held her daughter beside the hearth and let the warmth creep back into their skin. The baby's breath fogged the cold air in soft bursts. That alone told her the child was still alive, time blurred, in the way it does when grief sits close. Eleanor found herself staring at the baby's brow, then into the fire, then nowhere. Images returned in sharp, soundless flashes. Her husband Jonah scoffing under the cottonwood tree, his fingers twitching like he'd try to hold her hand again, then going still. The wagon men's eyes as they took the food, their horses already turned east. One had spat near her feet. "You're already dead out here," he'd said. She didn't remember crying. She remembered only silence after they left. Even the birds had gone. The cabin door creaked as the man returned. His arms carried bundles dried meat tied in oilcloth, a strip of willow bark, and a jug caked in frost. She looked at him, but not with gratitude, with disbelief. That someone would come back? That anyone would come back? He set the food down, took the herbs, and gestured toward the boiling kettle. She steeped the leaves. A bitter smell filled the room. She dipped a rag, pressed it gently to her daughter's lips. Drop by drop, the fever started to fade. That night, with the fire low and her child resting, Eleanor sat curled in a corner, knees pulled tight beneath her shawl. She watched the stranger from across the room. He didn't sleep right away. He sat cross-legged on the floor, a short knife in hand, whittling slowly at a block of cedar. His hands moved like he'd done it for years, not for art, not for distraction, but as ritual. When he finished, he stood and placed the carving on the hearthstone near the baby. A small horse, head bowed, one leg lifted like it was mid-step. Then he turned, lay near the door, and closed his eyes with his rifle resting across his chest. She couldn't stop staring at the wooden figure. It reminded her of a toy Jonas had once carved before they lost the first baby before the war. Before the hunger dot outside, coyotes sang to the moon. Inside, her daughter breathed. Proof of something enduring. Eleanor reached forward, just once, and turned the little horse toward her, so it faced the room. The storm arrived on the wind's back, howling down from the high passes, with a hunger that sank its teeth into every crack of the cabin. Snow hit the roof like fists of flour, dry and wild. Eleanor had seen cold before, had nearly frozen crossing the Platte, but this was a storm bred for ending things. It swallowed the light and muffled the earth, so that nothing existed but the fire inside and the hiss of snow at the seams. The stranger moved little. He kept the fire fed and sat close to the wall, carving a second shape now, this time slower. More careful. Eleanor didn't ask what it was. She didn't need to. Her daughter, now stronger, slept longer, her cheeks warming back into life. When she stirred, Eleanor sang to her. Soft old hymns, half-remembered lullabies. Words became easier when not meant for a man. Still, she found herself speaking to the room, to the child, to the crackling air. She told stories of the wagon train, of her first home on the prairie before the cholera came, of the man who had asked for her hand because she could shoot straighter than his brother, of how she'd sewn her own wedding dress from flour sacks and beads from a trader's child. She didn't cry, but her voice sometimes cracked like the wood in the fire. He said little, but when she asked where he was from, he answered without looking up. South of the Red River, and then after a long pause, rode with the cavalry, a long time ago. She didn't press. Something in his shoulders warned her. She imagined torchlight and screaming. He'd seen things then, things that no longer needed words. On the third day, just after the stew was set to boil, hoofbeats cracked across the snow. She froze. He stood. 3 men. They kicked open the door like they'd done it before, not afraid of locks or warnings. They were all mustached, 2 drunk, the third with a scarred badge pinned crook to his vest. Their spurs jingled like laughter. In a church? One looked at Eleanor and whistled. Double quotes. Well, look what the storm done. Coughed up. She stepped back, her baby clutched to her chest. The one with the badge stepped forward, eyes on her stained shawl. This your place? She didn't answer. The stranger was still, half hidden in the corner, shadowed by the firelight. The man reached out, fingers brushing the fringe of her shawl. The baby screamed. It broke the room like a shot. The man never saw it coming. One moment, his hand was on Eleanor's shoulder. The next, the stranger moved quiet as a blink, fast as a whip. His rifle cracked once. The badge man dropped, a howl in his thigh. Another moved to draw. The butt of the stranger's gun met. His wrist with a crunch sent the pistol clattering. The third fled, stumbling over his own boot prints. Silence fell, jagged and electric. The one on the floor whimpered, clutching his leg, blood melting the snow tracked inside. The other staggered back, hands up. Take him, the stranger said. His voice was quiet, but it filled the room like thunder. They dragged themselves out, swearing, limping, leaving behind the smell of fear and something. Eleanor stood, frozen, her child wailing now against her chest. The stranger knelt by the fire, poked the flames back to life like nothing had happened. The wooden carving rolled gently from his lap. She looked at him then, not with fear, but with something sharper, something like awe. Thank you, she said, and her voice caught. Then softer, sir. He didn't look up. You should leave? This place, he said. Come morning. Then he lay back against the wall again, rifle across his knees, eyes closed, outside. The wind swallowed the last of the prints. Inside. The baby's cry quieted. And something old and frozen in Eleanor began just barely to thaw. The storm passed some time before dawn, not with a final roar but a gentle hush that crept in like a blanket being pulled from the sky. By morning, the light returned in patches, filtered through clouds still bruised with the memory of snow. Eleanor stepped outside with her daughter bundled to her chest, the baby's breath warm against her skin. The snow had begun to melt in slow surrender, revealing slick brown mud and stone beneath. The land looked different now, like it had exhaled. The stillness was broken only by the creak of the wind in the high branches and the occasional drip from the eaves. She took a few steps beyond the cabin, boots sinking into the thawing earth. That's when she saw it half buried in the shallow bank behind the cabin, a leather boot, curled with age. Near it, bone, not animal. Smaller than it should have been. A child's jawbone and a single tooth. She didn't scream. Just looked. The land wasn't haunted. It had simply endured things no one bothered to bury. When she returned inside, the fire was already going. The stranger sat by the hearth, silent as always, sharpening a blade on a worn stone. She said nothing about the bones. He didn't ask where she'd been. But when he handed her a fresh strip of cured meat and she took it without flinching, something between them shifted. Later, she found herself speaking again, not like before, not to fill space, but from somewhere real. He asked if she'd always been out west. She said no, Illinois once before the sickness came. He said little in return, but when he did, his words carried weight. There was a village once, he said, his eyes on the flame. North of Santa Fe, just women and kids. Someone told us it was hostile. It wasn't. Eleanor didn't ask what he did there. The silence between his words told enough. His hands flexed when he said it, as though remembering the rifle they once held. He stared at the fire like it could undo time. That night, as she laid her daughter to sleep on the old cot, she caught a glimpse of his back when he bent to stoke the fire. A long, curved scar ran over one shoulder blade, shiny and deep. Not jagged like a blade, not puckered like a burned, a mark made to shame. She said nothing. Just turned away and let the thought settle. Desertion, maybe. Or a prison. Or justice gone wrong. At dawn, she rose early and boiled water. Found a tin of ground coffee left by whoever came before them. It was bitter, stale, imperfect. She poured a cup and set it beside his coat where he slept, curled near the door like he always did, boots still on. When he woke, he drank it without a word. But when he looked at her afterward, it was the first time his eyes didn't hold caution. They held memory. The baby Ruth she'd begun calling her again laughed that afternoon. It wasn't a full laugh, just a breathy squeal at the sound of the wooden horse tapping against the wall. But it filled the room more than fire ever. Had later that day, Eleanor suggested fixing the rocking chair. He didn't respond, but he fetched nails and a length of old rawhide anyway. They worked side by side, the silence no longer uncomfortable, just full. Her hands held the slats while his drove the nail. Once their fingers met. He didn't pull away, neither did she. By dusk, the chair creaked again, no longer broken. She placed it beside the hearth. Ruth slept in it for the first time, swaddled in Eleanor's old coat. The same one Jonas had buttoned for her once when her hands were too cold. That night, Eleanor lay on the cot, her back to the wall. Across the room, the stranger sat with his rifle across his lap, but his shoulders had eased. His head dipped now and then, chin brushing his collar. She didn't sleep, not right away. She listened to his breathing instead, low, steady, human. In a world that had tried to hollow her out, the sound of someone else breathing felt like proof that she hadn't vanished. The snow had thinned to crusted patches by the time they saddled the horse and set out for town. The sky had cleared, brittle and wide, the kind of winter blue that made things feel further away than they really were. Eleanor wrapped Ruth against her chest beneath the wool shawl and sat behind the stranger, arms around his waist, careful not to hold too tightly. The ride was quiet. The land lay open and bare around them, no trees, no fences, just bone-colored hills and the occasional vulture circling something they were lucky not to find. The town appeared like it always did, sudden, dusty, unimpressed with arrivals. They tethered the horse near the mercantile. Eleanor stepped down first. Her boots struck the ground like she'd been walking here all her life. The stranger followed, slower, quieter, his hat pulled low, his coat marked with dust and time. As they walked past the sheriff's office, a man on the bench outside raised his head. His mustache was white, thick like prairie snow, his hand resting on a cane more out of ceremony than need. He looked at the stranger for a long moment, then spit into the dirt and said, "Didn't think I'd see you again." The stranger nodded once. No words. Eleanor glanced between them, uncertain. The man with the cane leaned forward. "Justice," he muttered, not quite to her, but not law. Then he turned his gaze toward the saloon doors and let them pass. Inside the store, no one said much. A boy stared too long at the rifle slung across the stranger's back. The shopkeeper measured her with narrowed eyes, then softened when she asked about baby linen. They'd bought flour, beans, coffee, a cracked tin kettle, and a small blue ribbon for Ruth. No one asked who they were. They just watched. On the ride back, Eleanor turned it over in her mind. What had the old sheriff meant? What justice? What crime? But she didn't ask. Not then. That evening, as the sky turned to ash and gold, they returned to the cabin. The fire was still warm from the embers they'd banked. Ruth lay against Eleanor's chest, eyes fluttering with sleep, breath sweet and soft. As the stranger stacked wood by the hearth, she whispered the name aloud for the first time. "Ruth," she said. "After my grandmother?" Broke her leg crossing the smoky hill trail and still stitched her own boot to keep walking. He looked up. A rare flicker of something crossed his face. Admiration, maybe? Or memory. She sounds like someone worth remembering. She was, Eleanor said. And maybe Ruth will be too. The baby sighed in her arms, a contented sound. They didn't eat much that night, just boiled beans and coffee. It was enough. The fire cracked gently between them. The silence wasn't empty anymore. Then, slowly, without announcement, the stranger walked to the door and removed his hat. He didn't hang it, didn't toss it aside. He placed it carefully on the small table near the entrance. The gesture stopped Eleanor mid-breath. A man doesn't set his hat down unless he plans to stay, even if only for a little while. She turned to him, the firelight tracing his cheek, softening the lines carved by years. She let the silence stretch, then asked gently, "What's your name?" His jaw moved once. He looked at the flames, then at her, and for the first time he didn't look like a stranger. "Samuel." She nodded once, then said it again like she was tasting something rare and warm. "Samuel." Outside, the canyon wind had died. No howling, no storm. Just the steady pulse of fire and breath, and the soft, high laughter of a child who finally felt safe enough to dream. The wind had shifted by the time they reached the canyon again, softer than when she'd left it, though the rocks were still sharp, the air still dry with memory. The ruins of the wagon remained splintered wood, half-buried wheels, a rusted hub leaning like a broken monument to some small private war. The bones of fire still marked the place where she had sat, hungry, hollow, waiting to die. But the silence no longer felt like punishment. Samuel held the reins while Eleanor dismounted. Ruth slept against her back, bundled tight in the same shawl she'd worn that day, the weave of it still stiff with blood and dust. She pulled it loose now, unwrapped it slowly, fingered the fringe where her wedding thread had once been sewn by candlelight. She said nothing as she folded it carefully, knelt beside the wagon frame and buried it under a shallow mound of sand and stone. No cross, no marker, just an act of acknowledgement. This was not bitterness, it was ceremony. A grave not for a man or a child, but for a version of herself she would not carry forward. The canyon, in its infinite indifference, allowed it. Samuel stood a few paces behind her, saying nothing. That had always been his way. She didn't need words from him now. She only needed that steady presence, that shadow nearby that did not shrink or turn away. They rode east by mid-morning, the sun trailing them like a slow promise. The path narrowed through a ridge of limestone, then widened into a wide wash of mesquite and blackbrush. A hawk circled once, high above, then veered west. It was during that ride that Samuel spoke again, his voice low, edged with thought. "There's a valley past the red hills," he said, "rich soil. Stream runs all year. I helped raise the beams for a school there once. Mixed heritage families, Apache, white, Mexican. Nobody asks what you were before." Eleanor looked ahead, the trail dust curling around the hooves. Ruth stirred but didn't wake. "We could stop there," he added after a moment. She turned to look at him. His face was unreadable as always, though the lines around his eyes had softened. "Just for a while?" she said. The words weren't a promise, not yet, but they weren't resistance either. They were a door left open, a roof half built, and that was enough. They rode until the sun sank low behind the canyon walls. The sky turned the color of burnished copper, then cooled into ash. Ahead of them, the path bent gently, dipping into green they hadn't seen in weeks. Cottonwoods lined the riverbank in the distance, branches swaying like hands reaching for tomorrow. Samuel slowed his horse beside hers. They didn't speak. He reached for her hand. This time she didn't flinch. She let their fingers rest together, scarred, calloused, human. Behind them, the wind stirred dust over the wagon grave. Ahead, the world kept opening, and in the middle of it all rode three shadows across the orange-lit land, a woman who had buried her old self, a child whose breath had once gone still, and a quiet man who had once ridden away from war and chose, at last, not to leave.